Amandla. 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 Eta uni eta. Yes, you want them to hear you in the capitals. Eta uni eta. It is amazing to be back in my family again, amongst workers, the true salt of the earth. And I am very honored that I was given this prize by the FNV, and I must tell you a little story. It was the first time I'd been on an airplane. And I went to attend a meeting and ended up in Amsterdam at the invitation of the FNV. And it's the first time I had seen a strike in a developed country. And we went into this factory where there was a strike. And I asked the organizers, they allow you to be inside the factory when you're on strike? I said, yes, that's a right, we have won. Then I saw all of those workers involved and talking, and I said, there's no police people here or policemen with dogs and tear gas? They said, no, it's in our constitution, we have a right to strike. And then I saw them collecting strike pay. I said, you pay people who are on strike? I said, yes. And so I think from those ideas and that interaction, I was able to understand what was the goal we had set ourselves in those late 70s and early 80s for rights that we would want to have in our constitution. So thank you very much to the FNV. I want to reflect a bit on the issue of solidarity, because what is critical to understand is that we needed your solidarity at the most desperate time in our history, when we are standing at the edge of a precipice of a racial civil war, where apartheid had stolen our human dignity, and where we were robbed of our identity. And we knew that our struggle had to be fought. The trenches of the battle for human dignity and social justice was in the factory floor, it was in the mine shaft, it was in the shops, it was in our communities, in our villages. We had to carry that struggle. But what we must understand about the solidarity we built in the 1980s around the anti-apartheid struggle was that your actions meant the difference between life and death for many of us in the trenches of our battle. And I want to honor and thank you for that. I think today we need to rekindle that spirit of solidarity. It is not about asking for money. That was not the material things. It was about you being able to put pressure on your own governments to take a stand on our struggle for freedom. And your job was to do that in your countries. We never wanted you to come here and organize workers. That was a job for us. And that's an important lesson to understand with solidarity. Is that solidarity is built on the struggles that people themselves have to fight, whether that's in Palestine, whether that's in Sri Lanka, whether that's in Nigeria, or even South Africa itself. At the end of the day, solidarity must be to support people who are fighting their own struggles and their own battles. I want to reflect a bit on the issue of the negotiations and the conflicts we are seeing in the world, because today, in the 21st century, 1 in 3 people lives in a country that is facing conflict and war and violence. The victims who are innocent women and children. And we have to ask ourselves the question, why is there such an explosion of violence across the world? And, you know, if you go back to the lessons of Mandela, and one of the most profound things he said, when you want to make peace with an enemy, one has to work with the enemy until that enemy becomes your partner. Now, Here we are in Cape Town, the prison that he shared within the broader prison of apartheid. What were the lessons we learned here? One, that we have to build power. People who exercise arbitrary power are not influenced by good resolutions. They're not influenced by noble speeches and intentions. It's about building power so that when you're at the negotiating table, you are able to negotiate with bargaining power. That's something the unions have understood all the time. Nelson Mandela left prison at the point when he decided he wanted to leave prison, not when they offered him freedom, because he wanted to leave on his terms. The important thing about negotiations is that we had created a system, a state of political paralysis. We did not defeat the enemy militarily. We defeated him politically. We paralyzed the system, and mainly through the backbone of the trade union movement, because they could not attack that Achilles heel. We built power in the shop floor. It wasn't in the leaders. They were arresting our leaders. They were bombing our buildings, including our headquarters. But they could not destroy the organization on the shop floor. And it was on the basis of that power, where union leaders became leaders in communities, that we built up the power and built the coalition and alliances across South Africa that eventually forced the regime into a negotiation. But the important thing about leadership, and this is the distinguishing factor between the example of South Africa and many examples that face us in the world, is what makes leadership. It's when leadership recognizes that we are facing a catastrophe, a scorched earth, and makes the choice to stand against their own constituency and argue for a different way of doing it. And that's what we had in South Africa, that on both sides of the conflict arose leaders that were committed to going forward, although we were widely divergent. And what made South Africa the political miracle of a negotiated revolution was that ultimately we convinced, through the leadership of people like Nelson Mandela and Ahmed Kathrada and Emma Mashinini, we convinced our white brothers and sisters in this country that more was gained from democracy than what they enjoyed under apartheid. And what was the principle of that negotiation was one person, one vote in a democratic, non-racial, non-sexist South Africa. And ultimately, the Constitution had to guarantee that. And that's the type of leadership we need in many of the intractable conflicts that we face in the world today. The second issue I really want to talk to you about is that we know today that we face a crisis of humanity. We face the greatest test that humanity has ever faced. We stood here today and speaker after speaker talked about the crisis of food and hunger. We have more than enough food to feed every single person in this world. Yet 842 million people will go to bed today without the dignity of putting food on the table of their children. That in the 2 hours that would pass in this Congress, probably 600 children will die of causes that we could prevent. That's a jet airliner crashing somewhere full of innocent children every 2 hours. We know today that climate change is having a dramatic impact on poverty, on increasing poverty, on disrupting livelihoods and jobs. In fact, 97% of the scientists in the world say, if we do not take action on climate change, the people who will suffer are the working people and the poor. Yet, we have denialists in our governments, at the highest ranks of our governments. If 97% of engineers in Cape Town said, this roof is going to collapse if we stay in here, would we stay in here? So why do we not force our governments, by using our power, to pay attention to guaranteeing the future of this world for our children? I think we face a unique moment in the world today. Today, there is what I call a chemistry of circumstance. We have young people today in the deep sleuths and the Kayalishas here, 60 to 70% of them who have very few skills after 12 years of education, no jobs, and unlikely to have the dignity of labor in their lifetime. But they share something in common with kids in the slums of Lagos, or in the slums of Mumbai, or in the slums of Sao Paulo, or including in the developed world, in Spain and Madrid, in Greece and Athens. Today, there is a fact of life that the jobs, decent work, has become more and more out of the reach of the next generation. So we have to ask ourselves the question, is the system working? And clearly the answer that I've heard across many of the travels and discussions I've had is the system is not working for the majority. And just as much as we have won the right to an 8-hour working day, to maternity right, to social protection, we won it because we had power. And that's what we have to ask ourselves the question today, do we have power? And I think we have to look ourselves clearly in the mirror and ask ourselves, are we on the defensive? Do we understand what organizing in the 21st century is? Do we understand that this knowledge revolution has had a bigger impact on the nature of work than even the Industrial Revolution had? That it has to make us relook our organizations, our organizing strategies, our negotiating strategies, about how we look at informal work. In Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, 9 out of 10 jobs are informal. How many of us organize informal workers? 2/3 or 40% of the global economy is today informal. What do we do to represent those people that are increasing along the work chain? I think today what we need is a new global political narrative that takes a stand, because the knowledge revolution has been captured by an elite. It has created a world where inequality and poverty are increasing, where marginalization of particularly the next generation is increasing. That we have the reality that 85 people in the world today control more wealth than 3.5 billion people. Now, can we build peace in a society that excludes and marginalizes and alienates so many people? We cannot. So let us go back to the lessons about how we built power, how we negotiated, how we engaged our opponents, and how we created the rights. And go back to the day, the International Day of Human Rights, and go back to our declaration in 1948, which guaranteed every single citizen of this world inalienable rights to fairness, to human dignity, and to social justice. And ask ourselves the question today, how many of us enjoy those rights? What do we need to do today to make sure those rights are guaranteed for our children? And I think we will come back to this thing of saying, what do we need to do differently? How do we build the links between the formal and informal economy? How do we build the relationship and an intergenerational conversation on justice and human dignity and work, the work itself? How do we build an alliance with environmental groups, human rights groups, so that we build a coalition as powerful as the coalitions that ended slavery, that ended apartheid? And that coalition should be a coalition of power about the world that we want, that guarantees the dignity of labor, that guarantees shared growth, that guarantees the fundamental human rights of every human being. Thank you very much.